Hi, I'm Drew Savage. One of the most beloved Christmas specials gave us one of the most beloved Christmas songs. But for years, no one knew who sang it. This is the story behind the Christmas hit, You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch.
Behind the Christmas hits with Drew Savage.
Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss, had been writing best-selling children's books since 1940, when Horton Hatches the Egg was published. The Grinch was a character Seuss spent many years developing, and its long road to becoming a Christmas classic is a windy one. The word Grinch first appeared in Dr. Seuss's 1953 book, Scrambled Egg Super. One of the eggs came from an exotic bird called a beagle-beaked, bald-headed Grinch. The bird itself was not pictured. 2 years later, Seuss wrote a poem that was published in Red Book magazine called The Hoobub and the Grinch. This Grinch was not a bird. Instead, it was more of a salesman, and a bit of a slimy one at that, as he successfully sells a hoobub, a piece of wire it doesn't need. Geisel would continue to refine and develop the concept of a Grinch, one he was clearly taken with a couple of years later. He had just finished writing The Cat in the Hat, which was published in March 1957, and he immediately began work on his next book, one that would feature a much different Grinch character. He was still cynical, still grumpy, but looked completely different. This Grinch was on a mission to steal Christmas from a cheerful, holiday-loving town called Whoville. When the book was published that November, it was an instant hit and has gone on to sell over 7.5 million copies. The idea to turn the Grinch into a TV special came from legendary animator Chuck Jones. Jones co-created many of the Looney Tunes characters from the 40s and 50s and directed the Tom and Jerry cartoons of the 60s. But during World War II, he and Geisel collaborated on a series of animated shorts called Private Snafu. They were instructional videos for servicemen during the war, but done with humor to improve troop morale. The character of Private Snafu was voiced by Mel Blanc, who would later become the voice of another Chuck Jones co-creation, Bugs Bunny. Geisel wrote many of the episodes that Jones directed, and a long-lasting relationship was born. Jones wanted to animate a Dr. Seuss book. He thought they were perfect for TV animation. His first choice was How the Grinch Stole Christmas. But it took some convincing, as Geisel had had a bad experience when he wrote his first film, The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T. Not exactly a classic. Eventually, Geisel agreed, and Jones went to work. He had no trouble finding a home for the special. CBS had had a string of holiday hits. Rudolph in 1964, Charlie Brown in 1965, and they jumped at the chance to bring this best-selling children's book to TV. They gave the show a budget of over $300,000. That's more than 4 times the amount of money Bill Melendez was given to make the Charlie Brown special just a year earlier. At the time, the thought was a kid's Christmas special needs music, but none of the known carols or hymns would make sense in this story. Chuck Jones's idea was to write their own in Seussian Latin. Dr. Seuss himself would write most of the lyrics, including those to You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch. It took about 11 months to produce the show, over 25,000 drawings and animation cells, and 60 musicians to create the show. The voice of the narrator was also a Chuck Jones pick. Boris Karloff became famous in the 1930s for playing Frankenstein's monster, and he became a horror icon. But Jones picked him because of a spoken word album Karloff had released of him reading Rudyard Kipling stories. Jones says, quote, "Everyone thought of him as a villain, and he was so dear when you read it, you know?" Karloff recorded his parts first, both as narrator and the voice of the Grinch, but they still needed to record the music. In an interview with Hogan's Alley, a magazine covering the animated arts, voice actor Thurl Ravenscroft said he got a call from Jones asking him to come by the MGM studios at 10 a.m. that Thursday morning for a gig. Thurl was the voice of Tony the Tiger for Frosted Flakes breakfast cereal for more than 5 decades. He also did voice work for several of Disneyland and Disney World's most famous attractions, Pirates of the Caribbean, the Haunted Mansion, and the Country Bear Jamboree. He was a pro's pro. Thurl agreed to attend the voiceover session, but he had no idea what he was getting into. Sometimes that's the way it is in voice work, especially in the 60s. They actually recorded a few things for the Grinch that day. Thurl was one of 8 people on hand to do some voices for the Who's of Whoville. After about an hour of work, Jones pulled Thurl aside and said, "Here's a solo we want you to try. Give it a look." He handed him the lyric sheet to You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch. It's the only solo song in the special. Every other song features a chorus of voices. Dr. Seuss was in the studio at the time. Talk about intimidating. Thurl recalled doing about 3 different takes of the song. After the 3rd take, Dr. Seuss said he liked what he heard. Chuck Jones then asked, Thurl, what do you think? Ravenscroft said, hey, if you're happy, I'm happy. I've got another job to get to. And that was it. Never for a moment considering for a second that what he had just recorded would become a holiday standard for decades. How the Grinch Stole Christmas aired on December 18th, 1966, and was a smash. The soundtrack won a Grammy for Best Children's Record, and the special has been on TV every year since. But something happened that created a bit of a mystery. Outside of Boris Karloff, none of the voice actors were credited at the end of the show. That led people to just assume that Karloff also sang the Grinch's song. Others speculated that it was the voice of Tennessee Ernie Ford, a name you may not know, but he was famous in the 50s for his deep baritone voice. Dr. Seuss felt horrible about the omission and the misunderstanding that followed. He later personally called Ravenscroft to apologize for the error and would write letters to newspaper columnists across America to help get the word out that it was Thurl who sang the song. My name is Drew Savage. Thank you so much for listening. We love being a part of your holiday season. Hit subscribe, leave us a review, and never miss an episode of Behind the Christmas Hits.